So I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the term avoiding CCS. I think if we're discussing sectors, we should rather discuss which sectors should be avoided than which sectors should avoid. Which sectors should avoid using CCS. And the reason I'm saying that is we are in a climate emergency. And again, I keep repeating myself here, but we are dumping billions of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every year. And every ton that's dumped in the atmosphere today is a ton that is going to have to be removed from there and cleaned up by the kids who are growing up today, if they are going to stand any chance of having, you know, a livelihood that is acceptable. So for me, this liability has to stop immediately, and that should be separate from the discussion about which industries do we have in 10 years, which industries do we have in 30 years. We cannot afford continuing to dump billions of tons of CO2 this decade. At the same time, we should have a hard conversation about what are the industries that have a future and can be part of a future that we want. And that means also that CO2 storage is never going to be a bad investment from that perspective. CO2 transport networks need to be developed in a smart way. So what you want to do is create hubs that can take CO2 from a number of different installations, which gives you flexibility for the future, so that if some industry site doesn't exist 20 years from now, you haven't built a stranded asset of a pipeline to that site, but you have a hub that can take CO2 from other sites that still need it, and from new sites coming on, not least thinking of this from a perspective of carbon removals. So we know, and I think there was an interview in The Guardian once with Greta Thunberg about why she started her protests. What she said, among other things, was she had been reading the IPCC report and the IEA scenarios and all the scenarios about how we get to 1.5. And in every single one of those scenarios, she sees a massive amount of carbon removals, and all of it being based on CCS and biomass. And then you look at reality, and there isn't that much sustainable biomass, and there isn't that much CCS available. You start asking some hard questions. So I think that is, also to the point that we're going to need CO2 storage for the future, because we're going to need it to remove all the CO2 that we don't manage to stop today. But the first priority must be to stop that CO2 today from being a liability for future generations. Well-functioning markets. Of course, it brings us a little bit back to that societal good conversation. How to ensure a functioning market? First of all, a key piece of any functioning market is competition. And at the moment, there is no competition on CCS. And what I mean by that is mainly on the storage side. The storage side is the key. That is the enabler that, storage at the scale that we need, and again it's back to the billions of tons we're dumping every year of CO2 in the atmosphere. The scale that we need means storage is the enabler. Because if you don't have a prospect of that storage being developed at such a scale, then you don't get any investments flowing into industry sites capturing their CO2, because if you capture 1 million ton or 5 million tons of CO2, but you have nowhere to store it, well, then you just dump it. So, this is the key, but you need to have a functioning market for CO2 storage. And the challenge we have today is that the people who have the know-how, the companies that have the know-how and the resources to do that are the oil and gas companies. That is a problem for two reasons. One, because they aren't particularly good at fair competition, and so you need to have a strong regulation in place in order to drive that. But two, and that's maybe even more important here, CO2 storage can and will never be an activity that yields 20% plus minus return on investment for oil and gas, which is their typical return on investment for their other activities. And if that is true, they will never prioritize it. Because if they prioritize that, that means they use the rig that can drill a hole for storage for CO2 that could also be drilling more oil and gas production. And of course, if you get 20% return on investment on this one, you're not going to prioritize this one. And that's why what the European Commission has done now with the Net Zero Industry Act is so important. They have set a mandatory target for the provision of CO2 storage, operational or bankable CO2 storage, an obligation on the oil and gas producers in Europe to provide that, which means that they don't have the opportunity to prioritize what gives them more money. They have to prioritize this as well. That's not enough to make sure there's a competition that drives down the cost, but it is at least forcing them to engage in the activity. And those who don't have plans or ability to do so in the oil and gas world will then have to pay someone else to do it. That already starts, creating a potential competitive system. It's very important that, and that is also in the Net Zero Industry Act, and we need to fight for that to be a key element. This is open also to third parties. So we need to make sure that there's an industry developing that is not, as it were, companies that have a fossil dinosaur on their back, which is an activity that we need to phase out and therefore will be essentially a liability for some of those companies. We need to develop companies that are specialized in providing that CO2 storage in order to drive down the cost. So that's, I think that these are two key elements. And then, let's be clear. The Commission needs to understand that this is one of their most important jobs in terms of decarbonization this decade. Because one thing is the Commission is good at is securing a functioning market. That is the key competence of the Commission, the single market, and protecting that and ensuring that there aren't monopoly situations, ensuring that there aren't mergers and cartels. This is the key competence of the institution that is the same institution that basically provides the climate framework for industry. So you have a CO2 price that rises, and you have a reduction in free allowances that forces industry to act. Great. But if you then not at the same time provide fair and open access for those industries to the infrastructure that is being developed by a set of people in oil and gas, and hopefully more other companies, then your single market is no longer functioning. So this is the Commission's job, and I'm very happy to see that the Commission is finally taking that job seriously.